Hat, sunglasses, Pepsi, notes, sources, thick skin, check. You already know. Let's go. Golden Blooded is a college football YouTube channel for entertainment. So make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and let's get into our next college football video. Don't forget to send gear to represent your team. The address is P.O. Box 360, Liberty, South Carolina 29657. Well, we all know that the Pac-12 is in trouble. That is a fact. And then it came out a few days ago that the Pac-12 made a big-time boo-boo as far as two executives knew that there were discrepancies as far as a distribution partner paying the Pac-12 overpayments. And they knew about it years ago. This happened way back in 2016, 2017. These two guys were fired last Friday. This happened very, very recently. So that's a big old black eye for the Pac-12. We already know that USC and UCLA, they're going to be heading off to the Big Ten. And we also know that Oregon and Washington want to go off to the Big Ten. And we also know that the Four Corners have been at least talking to the Big 12. Now, whether they actually go to the Big 12, that remains to be seen. I really don't know. But we do know that both parties have been interested at some level, whether it's just dabbling or serious. So the Pac-12 is in deep, deep trouble. And I do think that in the future, the Pac-12 will need to add a few teams. Because I do think eventually that Oregon and Washington will end up in the Big Ten. Now, at the Four Corners State, that's still only 8 teams. You have Oregon State, Washington State, Cal, Stanford, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and Arizona State. 8 teams, that's it. And I know they want to kind of stick together because of the research and academics. There's a lot of money in that. A lot of people don't talk about that. There's a lot of money in the Pac-12's research and academics. So maybe those 8 teams do want to stick together, but to improve their TV deal, they might have to add a few teams. If they do that, what teams should they add? Well, I'm glad you asked me that, whether you did or not. I'm glad you asked me that because I do have some teams that I think would benefit the Pac-12, even if it really doesn't fit the label that the Pac-12 has created for themselves, even if these teams don't really add to the academics and research. And the teams that I'm really thinking about are Boise State, San Diego State, Fresno State, and Air Force. Yes, I think Air Force would be a good addition. Now, they could also add, I don't know, a Colorado State for Colorado or a UNLV because they have a good-sized city in Las Vegas, and I think that's where the Pac-12 championship is played. So just for those arguments, they could look at UNLV. But UNLV, they do not get a lot of fan support from their fans. Not at all. So I don't think, my personal opinion, I don't think UNLV would be a good addition for the Pac-12. But maybe just for the sake of, hey, we play in Las Vegas, so let's bring in UNLV. But I do think that it's important that the Pac-12 bring in more teams because they're down to 10 right now, counting Washington and Oregon. And I think in the future, Washington and Oregon will leave for the Big Ten. So in order to increase their revenue and increase their value and get a better TV deal, they're going to have to add some teams. But keep in mind, you don't want to be adding teams just to add teams. More pieces to split the pie with. You don't want to do that. You want to add teams that add actual value. And I do think that these teams add some value. Not a lot of value, not a tremendous amount, not something that like the Big Ten or the SEC would be looking for, maybe not even what the Big 12 would be looking for. But for the situation that the Pac-12 is in, these 4 teams I do think make a lot of sense. The first team, of course, is Boise State. And Boise State is actually investing into their facilities, not just their football facilities, but their entire sports complex. So Boise State is showing, hey, we're willing to invest into our sports complexes. That way we can be up to standard and be added to one of these Power 5 conferences. Because I did have Boise State at the top of the list as far as possibly going to the Big 12. But once the Big 12 added BYU, Houston, Cincinnati, and UCF, they kind of dropped down because the new TV deal for the Big 12 says that if they add any more Group of 5 teams, that does not guarantee any bump in revenue. So they kind of fell down the list. Now it's other teams and other Power 5 conferences, mainly the Four Corners and the Pac-12. And then if the ACC dissolves, they could go out to the east side and get some good teams for the east side of the Big 12. So as far as the Big 12 goes, Boise State has kind of fallen to the bottom of the list. A lot more teams are now ahead of them. But for the Pac-12, they could be at the top of the list. Now, that's not saying that the Pac-12 might not go after some Big 12 teams. Keep your eyes out for that Big 12. The Pac-12 could most certainly want to get a few teams from the Big 12. teams like maybe a Kansas State, a Texas Tech, maybe an Oklahoma State, teams like that. So if you count those teams, then Boise State would be actually lower on the list. But I don't think the Pac-12 will be able to get any teams out of the Big 12. And that's why I have Boise State at the top of the list. They've been one of the best group of 5 teams year in and year out in the Mountain West. More times than not, they win the Mountain West, and they've been to a few New Year's Six Bowls. So as far as the choices go, Boise State would be at the top as far as group of 5 teams out of the Mountain West. Another team is San Diego State. Near the city of San Diego, they just built a new football facility. So once again, they're showing that they're willing to invest money into their football facilities. And this is a football discussion. The Pac-12 does want to stay relevant in football. We can talk about academics and research all we want, which the Pac-12 is very, very much focused on that. Let's not beat around the bush and act like that's not important to the Pac-12. That is important to the Pac-12, but on the football side of things, they need to add a few teams, especially if Oregon and Washington decide to leave. Otherwise, the Pac-12 could get picked apart even more, and these other conferences get bigger, and the Pac-12 shrinks, and they might fall into oblivion. So San Diego State, I think that would be a decent addition. It's another school in the state of California. Of course, I don't know how Cal and Stanford would feel about San Diego State, and they have major strong pull in the Pac-12. They would kind of have to get over themselves and add San Diego State for the good of the Pac-12. I think adding San Diego State would be a great move for the Pac-12, not only in football, but especially in basketball. San Diego State has been especially good in basketball. But I think San Diego State would be competitive in the Pac-12 in football as well, and it would increase the value slightly. Not significantly, but slightly. Good enough to add a little bit to that TV deal. The next team, of course, is Fresno State, another California school. And they are in the Bay Area, right along with Cal and Stanford, so they're kind of in there with that mix. So I don't know how Cal and Stanford would feel about Fresno State because that's even closer to home. But once again, you'd have to get over yourself because Fresno State is one of the better brands in the Mountain West. Not the best brand like Boise State, but one of the better brands, especially the last 5 years. And I do think they would add some value to the Pac-12 enough, not significant, but enough to add them and get a slightly better TV deal when we're adding these teams. And the last team, of course, would be Air Force. I think Air Force would add enough to where everybody would gain. Like I said earlier, this is not going to be a significant increase. This is enough to raise it slightly and to keep the Pac-12 relevant. Honestly, if the Pac-12 goes down to 8 teams, how serious can the playoff committee take the Pac-12? And I know, I realize that the playoffs have been expanded to 12 teams, and basically champions of the Power 5 conferences are guaranteed a spot in the new playoffs. But how seriously can the playoff committee take the Pac-12 if they're whittled down to 8 teams? Not very serious in my opinion. So even though these 4 teams aren't powerhouse brands, at least you're adding good brands, decent brands, and you're adding numbers. You're getting the Pac-12 back to Pac-12 status. And you better believe that these 4 teams would be ecstatic to be in the Pac-12. They would be grateful to the Pac-12. They would probably kiss the feet of the Pac-12, do anything and everything that the Pac-12 says. So there is a lot of upside to adding these 4 teams for the Pac-12, not looking at the academics and research. And they could put a clause in there to where they don't have to share the research and academics with these 4 teams coming in. And I'm sure those 4 teams would be fine with that. They would just be grateful to be in the Pac-12 to where they'd be, all right, if you want to do that, that's fine. We weren't really interested in that as well, so y'all do that, and we're fine just being in the Pac-12. So there's a lot of things to take into consideration as far as the Pac-12 adding these 4 teams. I think it's a good move. It might not be the best move possible. I think the best move possible would be getting other Power 5 brands from the Big 12, but I think that is off the board. This is the next best move. So adding Boise State, San Diego State, Fresno State, and Air Force is probably the best decision that the Pac-12 can make once Oregon and Washington do leave. And I do think that will happen. Now, up until that, I think the Pac-12 is fine. As long as Oregon and Washington stay, the Pac-12 is fine. I know that's only 10 members, but still, they have some strong brands in there. But once those 2 leave, the Pac-12 goes down significantly when it comes to relevancy. So the Pac-12 needs to be thinking forward. You can't plan on these teams are staying no matter what. We have faith in Washington and Oregon. Well, I bet you had faith in USC and UCLA as well. So Pac-12, take my advice, plan ahead. Plan for just in case. and it will happen, Oregon and Washington go to the Big Ten. So y'all let me know in the comment section. Number 1, do you think Oregon and Washington will go to the Big Ten? If so, when? Number 2, do you think these are the best brands the Pac-12 can add once those 2 teams leave? And on top of that, do you think that the Pac-12 should actually add brands once Oregon and Washington leave? I think they should, but you might not agree with me on that. That's all I got for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on my next show.